It was one of those nights when everything seemed normal. My three friends, Sarah, Emily, Rachel, and me, Megan, had planned to sleep over at Sarah's house. She lived in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, in an old house that creaked every time someone stepped on the wooden floor. It wasn't our first time there, and we did plenty of scary movie nights in her basement before, but that night, the fear became all too real. It started like any other sleepover: pizza, talking about school, and of course, horror movies. Sarah's basement was a bit eerie, but perfect for the vibe we wanted. We settled into our sleeping bags, watching one of those movies that always ends with someone dead. Midnight came and went, and we were all exhausted, our eyes heavy with sleep. That's when Emily, who was lying on Sarah's bed, noticed something strange. "Guys, I think the bed is kind of tilted on one side," she whispered. We laughed, thinking it was just another excuse because of the movie. But she wasn't joking. There was something unsettling about the way her mattress was slanted, like there was something underneath it. Sarah, always the skeptic, went to check, but when she bent down to look under the bed, her face went pale. She stepped back and stared at us. "There's someone here." Those words froze the air in the basement. In a second, the unease turned into pure terror. I couldn't breathe properly, and Rachel grabbed my arm so tightly I could barely feel my hand. Sarah yanked the mattress to the side with a quick motion, and that's when we saw it. Under her bed, squeezed between the frame and the floor, was a man. He stared at us, wide-eyed, as if he was just as shocked as we were. Everything exploded at once. Emily screamed, Rachel started crying, and I was simply frozen. It made no sense. How had he gotten there? How long had he been hiding? Before we could react, the man started to move, like he was ready to attack or flee. That's when Sarah, without thinking twice, threw herself at him. She, of all people, the calmest, used the strength of a real fighter. It was a quick struggle, but she managed to pin him down, pressing his body against the floor while Emily shakily called the police. The next few minutes felt like hours. The police arrived faster than I expected, their sirens lighting up the dark street outside. They arrested the man, and when the officers questioned us, we were all confused, unsure how he had gotten in. There were no signs of forced entry. He had simply been there. The next morning, we learned the full truth. The man had broken into the house earlier in the afternoon, before we even arrived. He had spent the entire day hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike. If Emily hadn't noticed the bed, I can't even imagine what could have happened. After that, I never went back to Sarah's house. The sleepover that had started as a fun night turned into a nightmare we all carry with us to this day. And no matter how hard I try, I can never forget the image of that man, watching us from under the bed, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. We just wanted a weekend away from everything, a chance to disconnect and enjoy nature. My three friends, Hannah, Rachel, Emily, and me, Laura, rented a secluded cabin in the mountains of Vermont, near a small town called Woodstock. The plan was simple: spend the weekend relaxing, do some hiking in the forest, and enjoy the silence. No cell service, no worries. Just us and the sound of the trees swaying in the wind. On the second day, we decided to explore a trail near the cabin. The hike started off peaceful, with the sound of leaves crunching under our feet and the scent of damp forest in the air. We had been walking for about 30 minutes when we saw him. A man was standing among the trees, not too far away, staring at the ground. It was odd. What caught our attention first was the smell. A strong, rotting stench like something had been dead for days. We exchanged uneasy glances, but tried not to judge too quickly. The man was tall, thin, dressed in dirty, torn clothes, like he hadn't changed in weeks. When he saw us, he only nodded, but the smile he gave was disturbing. We quickened our pace, trying to stay calm. Emily made a joke about him being some hermit who lived in the woods, but deep down, we all felt the same. Something was deeply wrong. We rushed back to the cabin as fast as we could, laughing to mask our discomfort. But when we got there, something chilled us to the bone. Looking back, we realized the man had followed us. He kept a safe distance, but the feeling of his eyes fixed on us made my stomach churn. "He's following us," Rachel whispered, trying not to panic. In that moment, without thinking twice, we ran inside the cabin and locked every door and window. The rest of the afternoon was tense and quiet, with us arguing over what to do, whether to call the police or just try to ignore the incident. As night fell, the forest around the cabin became even darker. The wind blew against the windows, creating sounds that set our nerves on edge. We tried to sleep, but the image of that man, with his foul stench and that eerie smile, wouldn't leave my mind. It was hard to relax, and every little noise made me jump. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly with a strange feeling. Something was wrong. The silence was too heavy. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and that's when I saw him. He was there, the man, inside the cabin. He stood in the living room, not far from our door, and the smell, that same horrible stench from earlier, now filled the room. He was watching us, his eyes glinting in the faint moonlight coming through the window. My body froze. I wanted to scream, but for a moment, I was paralyzed with pure terror. Finally, I managed to let out a scream that woke all the girls. They jumped out of bed, and chaos erupted in the room. The man, realizing he had been spotted, fled through the back door, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. We called the police immediately, trembling with fear and trying to comprehend how he had gotten inside without us noticing. When the police arrived, they searched the entire area around the cabin, but the man seemed to have vanished without a trace. However, as they investigated further, they found something that left us even more terrified. Just a few yards from the cabin, hidden in an old, abandoned shed, the officers discovered several bodies. The smell we had noticed earlier. That was it. The man wasn't just a vagabond in the woods. He was a killer, and that shed was where he hid his victims. The police told us that he had probably been watching us for longer than we realized, maybe since the moment we arrived at the cabin. The next few hours were a blur. We were taken to a safe location while the authorities investigated. The realization that we had been hunted by someone so dangerous left us in shock. I still remember the terrified looks on my friends' faces, Emily's hand gripping mine as the police asked us questions. To this day, I don't know how we made it out of that night alive. The man was never found, but one thing is certain. I will never forget the smell, the smile, and the stare of the stranger in the forest. It was supposed to be a quiet night. My 4 friends, Jessica, Amanda, Brianna, Emily, and me, Kate, were gathered at Jessica's house in a quiet suburb of Knoxville, Tennessee. Her house was a typical old neighborhood home, with large windows and surrounded by trees that blocked most of the view to the street. Perfect for a night of chatting and relaxing. We were all scattered around the living room, eating snacks and watching a comedy, with no plans for the night other than to hang out. Outside, the night was dark and cold, and a thin mist covered the yard. The living room window, which faced the densest part of the yard, was slightly open, letting in a cool breeze. We were all distracted, laughing at a silly joke, when we heard soft knocks coming from the direction of the window. We froze for a second. It was such an unexpected sound that the lighthearted atmosphere turned into immediate tension. Amanda, always the bravest, got up to investigate. She took a look out the window, but didn't see anything. "Must have been the wind," she said, laughing, trying to break the awkward mood. But no sooner had she sat back down than the sound returned. This time, firm knocks, louder and more insistent. I could feel my stomach turning, and the silence in the room became unbearable. "That's not the wind," Emily said, visibly nervous. This time, Jessica got up, cautiously crossed the room, and peeked through the curtain, but she didn't say a word. She stood still, and in a second, we saw something we would never forget. Before any of us could react, a hand shot through the window, grabbing Jessica's arm and yanking her hard. She let out a sharp scream, and we were in shock, paralyzed, as she struggled against that hand that seemed to come out of nowhere. The horror of the moment overwhelmed me. The arm pulling her was strong, violently dragging her toward the window. This wasn't a dream, it wasn't a prank. This was really happening. Brianna was the first to react. She lunged at Jessica, grabbing her waist while Amanda and I ran to help. There was a real struggle going on, and for a moment, it seemed like Jessica would be pulled right out of the window. I clung to her arm with all my strength, feeling the sweat drip down my face. Emily was screaming in the background, completely panicked, while we fought against this mysterious force. After what felt like hours, though only seconds had passed, we managed to pull her back. The hand suddenly let go, and Jessica collapsed onto the living room floor, gasping for air in a state of shock. We slammed the window shut in the blink of an eye and locked all the doors. No one could say a word. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by Emily's sobs and Jessica's frantic whispers, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. We tried to calm our nerves, but something inside me told me we weren't alone. My heart pounding, I approached the window, cautiously pulling the curtain aside. Outside, in the middle of the yard, under the faint light of the street lamp, I saw two figures running across the property. They were quick, shadowy forms, almost invisible in the darkness, but they were there. I felt the blood drain from my face and called the others over to see. Amanda grabbed the phone and called the police immediately. When the officers arrived, it didn't take long for them to find a wooden ladder leaning against the side of the house, right below the window where Jessica had almost been pulled through. Panic gripped us as we realized those people had planned this, had been watching us long before we even knew it. The police searched the area but didn't find anyone else. They said it was possible the intruders had just been trying to scare us, but I knew it wasn't just a prank. It was something much more sinister. The feeling of being watched stayed with me for days. Jessica couldn't sleep for weeks, and even now, years later, we all still remember that night with a chill down our spines. We never found out who those people were or what they really wanted, but the terror of that hand appearing at the window has never left us. If you're enjoying the stories so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now let's dive into the next story. Birthday parties have always been special to me, but that sleepover became a night I'll never forget, and not for the reasons I expected. It was my best friend Lily's birthday, and we were all gathered at her house, one of those big old homes in a quiet neighborhood in Charleston, South Carolina. Me, Lily, Emma, Claire, and Maddie were in the middle of what felt like a perfect night of fun. We'd eaten cake, played video games, and watched a scary movie like we always did at sleepovers. It was past 2 a.m, and we were all sprawled out in Lily's room, debating whether to watch another movie or tell ghost stories. The atmosphere was light and carefree, with laughter bouncing around the room, when Emma's phone suddenly rang. The loud ringtone startled us, as no one was expecting calls at that hour. Emma picked up the phone and glanced at the screen, confused. "Unknown number," she said, and we all giggled, thinking it might just be a prank call. Smiling, Emma answered and put it on speaker, expecting something silly. The voice on the other end was deep and monotone, and it said only 4 words, "I'm watching you." The room fell silent in an instant. For a second, we just stared at each other, unsure of what to say. Lily was the first to break the silence, letting out a nervous laugh. "Come on, someone's trying to scare us." Emma laughed too, but the way she quickly hung up the phone unsettled me. "It's probably just a prank," she said, trying to sound casual. Deep down, we all wanted to believe that, so we went back to our conversations, brushing it off as a joke. But then Claire, who was sitting closest to the window, glanced outside, and that's when the real panic began. She stood up slowly, her face turning pale. "Guys, there's someone outside," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. We all rushed to the window, and at the same moment, we saw what Claire was talking about. There, standing on the sidewalk in front of Lily's house, was a man. He was completely still, wearing a dark coat that almost blended into the shadows of the street. But what terrified me the most were his eyes. Even from a distance, I could feel him watching us, fixated, as if he were waiting for something. He didn't move, just kept staring at us in a way that made my heart race. "This can't be real," Maddie muttered, her eyes wide. "Is he actually watching us?" Lily rushed to grab the phone to call the police, but before she could dial, the man simply turned and vanished into the darkness, as if he had never been there. We ran around the house, locking every door and window, the panic building inside us. Even after he disappeared, the feeling that he was still out there wouldn't go away. Every shadow outside seemed to shift. Every noise from outside sounded like footsteps. None of us could relax. When the police finally arrived, there was no trace of anyone on the street. They told us it was probably just some prankster or someone taking advantage of the situation to scare us. But the fear I felt that night, seeing those eyes locked onto the house, wasn't a joke. A few days later, we found out something even more disturbing. Talking to neighbors, we learned that weeks before, a man had been arrested for breaking into homes in the area, and he had been watching teenagers, studying their routines, waiting for the right moment to strike. After that night, we could never joke about unknown number calls again. And to this day, whenever I look out my window, a part of me still expects to see that man standing in the street, watching me from the other side of the darkness. What was supposed to be a fun backyard camping night turned into something I'll never forget. It was the start of summer, and my friends Josh, Dylan, Tyler, and me, Ethan, decided to pitch a few tents in my backyard, which sat in a quiet area of Asheville, North Carolina. The yard was huge, with a dense forest just beyond the edge of our fence, making it perfect for our nighttime games of manhunt, a kind of intense hide-and-seek. The night was perfect. After roasting marshmallows and telling scary stories around the fire, we decided to start the game. We scattered across the yard, the tall trees casting shadows that made for ideal hiding spots. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and the typical adrenaline of a camping night. But things started to change when, while hiding near the fence by the forest, I saw something that didn't feel right. In the middle of the darkness, among the trees, I noticed a tall figure. He was about 50 meters away, and at first glance I thought it was just Tyler trying to hide. But when I looked closer, my heart began to race. It wasn't Tyler. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, almost blending into the shadows of the forest. He moved slowly, like he wasn't in any rush, heading deeper into the woods, not caring about the game or the fact that someone might be watching. I froze. I stood there, not sure what to do, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. But when the man turned his head in my direction, I realized this was real. Without thinking twice, I ran back to the group, my heart pounding. "There's someone out there in the forest," I shouted, barely able to catch my breath. Everyone stopped, confused about what was happening. I explained what I saw, and of course at first they thought it was just another one of my attempts to spice up the game. But something in my voice made them take me seriously. We went inside and told my dad. He grabbed a flashlight and went to check the perimeter, but he didn't find anything. He took a quick look into the woods and said there was no sign of anyone out there. "Maybe it's just a lost hiker or something," he said, trying to calm us down. But the unease wouldn't leave me. The feeling that I had seen something more dangerous than just a passerby stayed with me. With everything resolved, we went back to the tents. Still on edge, it took all of us a while to relax. I lay in my sleeping bag, my head spinning with thoughts, the sounds of the night filling the silence. That's when I heard something. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The zipper of the tent slowly being opened. At first, I thought it was Josh or Dylan trying to pull a prank. "Dude, knock it off," I mumbled, not even opening my eyes. But the sound continued. When I finally opened my eyes, a wave of ice shot through my body. The silhouette at the tent's entrance wasn't one of my friends. It was the man, the same one I had seen before, crouched there, with his hand still gripping the zipper. He didn't say a word, just stared at me, his eyes dark and emotionless. For a second, I was completely frozen, but instinctively I let out a scream. The man took a step back and disappeared into the darkness before any of my friends could understand what was happening. I kept screaming, waking everyone up. Within seconds, my dad came running out of the house, and that's when everything descended into chaos. The police were called immediately. They searched the woods and the backyard, but found no sign of the man. No footprints, no evidence. It was as if he had never been there. But I knew what I had seen, and the fear I felt that night has never left me. Even after the police left and my friends tried to go back to normal, no one could sleep. We stayed awake, all huddled in the living room, still in shock from what had happened. Who was that man? What did he want? We never got any answers. But one thing is certain. Since that night, we've never camped in the backyard again. The image of that man standing at the entrance of my tent still haunts me to this day. A constant reminder that no matter how safe things seem, you never know who might be watching you from the darkness. When my friend Luke invited me to sleep over at his place, I didn't hesitate. We lived in the same city, in a quiet suburb of Denver, Colorado, where nothing particularly exciting ever happened. The houses were all the same, with white fences and neatly kept yards, and our sleepovers were usually filled with video games and late-night snacks. It was supposed to be just another night like that. Everything seemed normal. We played games until we started getting tired, and around midnight we decided to sleep. Luke's bedroom was upstairs at the end of a long hallway, and the house was really quiet at night. The only sound was the soft hum of the heater running. I fell asleep quickly, but something woke me in the middle of the night. At first, I thought I had dreamed the noise, but then I heard it clearly. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, like someone was walking through the house. It wasn't unusual for Luke's parents to wake up in the middle of the night, so I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But the footsteps continued, growing closer to the stairs that led to the second floor. I turned to see that Luke was still sound asleep. But as I tried to make sense of what was happening, I saw something that made my heart stop for a moment. From where I was lying, I had a clear view of Luke's bedroom door, which was slightly ajar, letting a sliver of light from the hallway in. That's when I saw a figure moving through that crack, and it wasn't anyone from the house. It was Luke's neighbor. He lived next door and had always been considered a bit strange. Luke had told me stories about him before. A middle-aged man who kept to himself, rarely spoke to anyone, and always seemed to watch the neighborhood kids with an unsettling curiosity. But he had never been more than a distant figure. Until now. The man was climbing the stairs, his footsteps muffled by the old wood, heading straight for Luke's room. Panic washed over me. I didn't know how he had gotten in, but that didn't matter at the moment. All I knew was that he was coming, and we needed to protect ourselves. Without making a sound, I got out of bed and rushed to the door, closing it quietly, praying he hadn't noticed I was awake. I locked the door as quickly as I could and backed away, breathing heavily. Only then did I wake Luke with a shove. "There's someone here," I whispered, my voice shaking with fear. He blinked, confused, but I didn't have time to explain. Moments later, the sound of the doorknob turning broke the silence. The neighbor was trying to open the door. The quiet of the house was shattered by the metallic clinking of the knob being twisted again and again. Luke jumped up, now fully awake, and started pushing the dresser against the door, trying to block the entrance any way he could. "Go away!" I yelled, my voice trembling. Luke joined in, and we started shouting as loudly as we could. Our screams echoed through the house, and soon we heard the hurried, frantic footsteps of Luke's parents rushing up from downstairs. As soon as they reached the bottom of the stairs, the neighbor's footsteps stopped abruptly. We heard the sound of someone sprinting down the stairs and the front door slamming shut. Luke's parents burst into the room seconds later, confused and alarmed. We were in shock, barely able to explain what had happened, but we pointed to the door and told them about the neighbor. The police were called immediately. When they arrived, they searched the house, but the neighbor had already vanished into the darkness. The authorities discovered he had broken in through a window in the back of the house. They knocked on his door that same night, but he wasn't home. We didn't know if he had planned to hurt us or something worse, but just thinking about him being inside the house, climbing the stairs, coming straight for Luke's room, it's something that still haunts me to this day. After that night, the police kept a watch on the area, and the neighbor ended up moving away shortly after. But ever since then, I haven't been able to sleep in a house without locking every door and window. And every time I hear footsteps in the middle of the night, I remember that sound of Luke's neighbor coming up the stairs. I've always loved sleepovers. There's nothing better than spending the night with my best friends, laughing, watching movies, and eating junk food. That night was one of those, and it seemed like everything would be fun and easygoing. Me, Maddie, and my two friends, Claire and Jenna, were at Claire's house, which was in a quiet neighborhood in Richmond, Virginia. She had a basement that was perfect for these kinds of nights, with a giant couch, a big TV, and some dim lights to set the perfect mood for watching movies. Claire's mom had gone out that evening to visit a friend and wasn't coming back until later, so we had the house to ourselves. We didn't mind. If anything, we were excited about it. It meant more freedom to watch scary movies and eat whatever we wanted. It was already past midnight, and we were in the middle of a movie marathon, wrapped in blankets and debating which movie to watch next. It was that typical calm lull of a sleepover when the laughter dies down and the tiredness starts to creep in. That's when we heard the footsteps. It came out of nowhere, the sound of someone walking upstairs. The three of us stopped at the same time, sitting in silence, looking at each other. "Did your mom come back?" I asked, trying not to sound worried. Claire shook her head, confused. "Not yet. She said she'd be back later." Jenna, always the skeptic, suggested it was probably just the wind or the house settling, the kind of noise you get in old homes. But the sound was too clear to ignore. They were footsteps, deliberate and steady, as if someone was slowly walking around upstairs. "Should we check?" Claire suggested, her voice a mix of curiosity and nerves. Reluctantly, we decided to go upstairs. When we reached the top of the stairs, the house was completely empty. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our own footsteps on the wooden floor. We passed through the living room, into the kitchen. There was no sign that anyone had come back. Everything was just as we had left it. "Weird," I muttered, trying to mask my unease. But just as we were about to head back down to the basement, something else caught our attention. A shadow, long and vague, moved across the hallway. It shifted slowly from one side to the other, like it was pacing between the rooms. We froze. For a moment, we tried to rationalize it, maybe car headlights from outside or a reflection of something. But the shadow didn't look like a trick of the light. It had a shape like a person, and worse, it seemed aware of our presence. "Did you see that?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. Claire and I just nodded, too scared to speak. The shadow appeared again. This time, it moved faster, darting across the hallway as if in a hurry. It was almost impossible to believe what we were seeing. We didn't hear any more footsteps, but the feeling that something or someone was there with us kept growing. The fear was paralyzing, and none of us could move. All we wanted was to get out, but it felt like something was holding us in place. Finally, Claire broke the silence. "We need to get out of here." Without hesitation, we rushed down the stairs back to the basement, grabbed our phones, and locked ourselves down there, trying to figure out what to do. We called Claire's mom, but she said she was still an hour away. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every little sound in the house made us jump, and I could barely breathe. We didn't know if what we saw was real or if we were just scaring ourselves. But one thing was certain: we weren't leaving the basement until someone came home. When Claire's mom finally arrived, we bolted to the front door before she even had a chance to turn off her car. We tried to explain what had happened, but our words came out jumbled and frantic. She tried to calm us down, insisting it was probably just our imagination, that the house made strange noises at night. But we knew. The three of us swore we had seen the same thing: a shadow moving up and down the hallway, as if it was watching us. In the end, Claire's mom did a sweep of the house to make sure everything was okay. There were no signs of a break-in, no doors or windows left open. But when she checked the back door, something caught her eye. The security latch, which was always in place, was unlocked. None of us slept that night. Even though Claire's mom tried to convince us it was nothing, we knew that something or someone had been in the house with us. And to this day, whenever I hear footsteps upstairs, I feel that same cold shiver, wondering if I'll see that shadow again, moving through the hallway. I've never been a fan of old houses. Something about them always made me uneasy. The creaking floors, dark rooms, and that heavy air of untold stories. So when my friend Jess suggested we have her sleep over at a century-old house her aunt had just bought, I had my doubts. But since everyone else was excited, I didn't want to be the one to ruin the fun. Besides Jess, there were Emily, Sophie, and me, Megan. We made our way to the house, which was in a secluded area in a small town north of New York. The house was exactly what I feared. Huge, full of narrow hallways and long staircases leading to endless floors. Jess's aunt gave us a quick tour before heading out to dinner with friends. When we got upstairs, she casually mentioned that this part of the house hadn't been used in years. A chill ran down my spine. The upstairs was completely empty, with old rooms and furniture covered in dusty sheets. We went back downstairs, trying to ignore how unsettling the place felt. The night started like any other sleepover. We watched movies, made popcorn, and played a few games. It was past midnight when we started getting tired, but that's when something strange happened. In the middle of a silly conversation about the horror movie we had just watched, we heard laughter. It was soft and distant, like the sound of a child playing, but it was clearly coming from upstairs, the very place Jess's aunt said had been empty for years. We froze. Emily, always trying to be the brave one, was the first to speak. "Did you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice lower than usual. I nodded, feeling my heart race. We tried to brush it off, thinking it might just be our imagination or the echo of the house. But then we heard it again, soft giggling, like more than one child was upstairs. This time it was closer. Sophie, half hesitant, half curious, suggested we go check it out. Every part of me wanted to say no, but the others were curious, and against my better judgment, I agreed. We crept up the stairs, the floorboards creaking under our feet, each step making my anxiety grow. When we reached the hallway upstairs, the air was colder, like something wasn't right. The hallway was dark, only faintly lit by the pale moonlight streaming through the grimy windows. The laughter had stopped, but there was a heavy feeling, as if something or someone was watching us. We split up to check the different rooms. Jess and I stayed in the hallway while Sophie and Emily went to check one of the far rooms. That's when I saw something that sent a chill through me. On the floor in the hallway, near the stairs, were old toys. Wooden toys, the kind children played with a century ago. They were scattered about, as if left in a hurry, but I was certain they hadn't been there when we came up earlier. "Jess, look at this," I whispered, pointing at the toys. She came closer, her eyes wide with shock. "Those weren't here before," she said, her voice shaky. Before we could process what was happening, we heard it again, a laugh, clearer this time, coming from one of the rooms. My entire body tensed, and without thinking, I bolted for the door, screaming for the others. Emily and Sophie rushed out of the room, their faces pale. "We need to leave," Sophie yelled, and without any argument, we ran downstairs as fast as we could. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the living room, all the lights on, wrapped in blankets as if they could protect us. None of us could sleep. When Jess's aunt came home the next morning, she immediately noticed something was wrong. Hesitant, we told her what had happened. I expected her to laugh and tell us it was just our imagination, but what she said next made the blood run cold in my veins. Many years ago, the house had been an orphanage. In the 1920s, a terrible fire broke out and several children died, trapped upstairs. The history of the house was known to only a few people in town, but the previous owners spoke of strange noises, laughter, and even seeing toys move on their own. No one ever stayed in the house for long. We left the house that morning and never went back. Jess's aunt sold the property a few months later. And to this day, whenever someone brings up that sleepover, I get a chill down my spine, and the laughter of those children echoes back into my memory. I never used to worry much about neighbors. I live in a quiet area of Boulder, Colorado, and up until then, everyone around had been friendly. But when the house next door was rented out to a new family, things started to get strange. The new neighbor, Ryan, seemed normal at first glance. He was in his 30s, had dark hair, and a somewhat distant expression, but nothing too unusual. What I didn't know was that he would turn one of the calmest nights of my life into an absolute nightmare. It was a Friday night, and a few friends came over for a sleepover. We were in my room, playing video games, eating pizza, and chatting late into the night. We were in the middle of an intense Call of Duty match when we heard a loud noise from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, since the area is known to get pretty windy, but the noise didn't stop. Banging sounds, things crashing, as if someone was throwing furniture against the wall. We decided to ignore it, thinking it was nothing serious. Suddenly, the front door flew open. Before we could react, Ryan appeared in the hallway of my house, his eyes wide and completely out of it. He didn't say a word, just walked in and started throwing things out the window like he was in some kind of trance. Papers, pillows, even one of my backpacks went flying through the open window. We were frozen for a few seconds, trying to comprehend what was happening. Then he looked straight at my PlayStation. That console was my pride and joy, and when I saw he was about to toss it out the window, something snapped inside me. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, but Ryan didn't stop. He grabbed the PlayStation, and for a moment, it looked like he was going to hurl it with all his strength. I managed to run over and grab it from his hands at the last second. He then looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, a mixture of confusion and fear. It was like he had just realized where he was and what he was doing. Without a word, he dropped whatever he was holding and ran out the front door. We stood there in stunned silence, listening to his footsteps fade into the night. Still in shock, we locked all the doors and windows, trying to process what had just happened. It was as if he had been in some sort of episode, completely unaware of everything around him. We tried to get back to our sleepover, but the feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't leave our minds. The silence in the room was heavy, and none of us could sleep properly that night. A few days later, things got even stranger. I was getting ready for bed when, in the reflection of my window, I saw a figure standing in the street, staring directly at my house. It was him, Ryan. He wasn't moving, just standing there on the sidewalk watching me. My heart started racing, and I quickly backed away from the window, convincing myself he couldn't see me. When I gathered the courage to look again, he was gone. The weirdest part came the next morning. His house was empty. The entire family had moved out overnight, without warning, without any sign that they were leaving. I asked my parents if they knew anything, but no one had heard a thing. Ryan and his family vanished as if they'd never existed. To this day, I still think about what happened that night. The outburst, the way he barged into my house, and then his cold, unblinking stare as he watched me. I never found out what really made him act that way, and maybe it's better that I didn't. But one thing is certain. Ever since then, I can't walk past a window without glancing out to the street, afraid that one day, I'll see him standing there again, watching me from the darkness. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out Scary Fire Lookout Stories by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.